Welcome to tonight's webinar. We're here to talk about managing fear with Dr. Rebecca Williams. Rebecca's back by popular demand, and I think we could probably just have you on every night forever, but that would probably get a little bit busy for you. This is part of continuing into March because we felt February went really well, and although schools are going back and things are starting to open up a little bit, the feedback was very much that there was still value in trying to get some sessions out. So we are continuing into March, thanks to support from Adidas and 510, who've made this possible. And without further ado, I think I'll pass over to Rebecca and let's get managing our fear. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca. Always confusing that. Right, welcome everyone. I'm really chuffed to be here again tonight. I'm just gonna share my slides, my screen, so just bear with me for 2 seconds. I'll make sure I get the right one up. And move the toolbar out the way. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that, and I'm sure Rebecca will let me know if not. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about what to do if you have a really scary moment on a route or a problem, or even if you kind of have a sort of panic attack. And I wanted to share with you my own story about probably one of the most scared I've ever been. And bizarrely, it was seconding a route in Pembroke. I can't remember if it was called Deep Space or Inner Space, but if you've done it, you'll know that it goes up this cave on really nice big juggy holes, and then does this hideous traverse across a yawning chasm inside the cave. And that was the bit that really, really got me. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because if I tell it from start to end and then we go through the presentation, you'll perhaps see some of the key points where I could have done something to avert this panic attack that I had, but I didn't in the moment. But you know, it makes for great learning, so I'm going to extract all the learning out of it. So I had just cycled for a couple of hours to get to Pembroke and meet up with a friend. So I was typically a bit late, so I was rushing. So I arrived there. It was like, let's do something, you know, relatively fun and straightforward and get kind of warmed up and getting on in the day a little bit. So my friend hit upon this route, Deep Space, Inner Space, can't remember what it was called. And I had a quick look, and actually I was a bit put off because climbing in a cave never really is not my thing. I'm not really into that. I would rather have the kind of the open space around me. But I thought, okay, fine. It says it's fun in the guidebook. Yeah. So I said, well, you lead. You know, I've just got here and go for it. So they led up, and you know, went up first pitch, no problem. Went out across the traverse, and as I was there on the belay, I started to get really worried about this traverse. There wasn't a huge amount of gear in it, and as you know, seconding, you know, if there's not loads of gear and you take a fall, you're going to have a massive swing. And it was really dark in there. I could see it was really kind of awkward back and footing across this chasm and then out onto the main face, and I just really was not keen on it. So there's this kind of dark tunnel with a light at the end, awkward moves, and I was starting to get quite wound up on the belay. Anyway, I did kind of go across. I found I couldn't really do the route in the way it was intended. My legs were too short to do some back and footing. I got really stressed about getting a piece of gear out, which seemed to be really high and out my reach and a bit jammed. And when I got to the belay, I was hyperventilating and really, really stressed, swearing, kind of tearful, the whole lot really. And I just was kind of standing there shaking and all the rest of it. And my friend said, Beck, you've got to help yourself. Come on, clip in. And like that, I kind of was able to see myself. So I was able to sort of step outside the experience I was having and see that I was hyperventilating and not doing all these things. And then I kind of was able to sort of see that, you know, gosh, nothing had happened. I actually had survived and it was fine. And then clipped myself into the belay, finished the rest of the pitch and collapsed in a heap and went off to the pub. So that's my kind of story. But there's some themes and key points in there, I think, which I'm going to come to as we talk through this. And I just would like to get a quick show of hands or whatever in the chat if you've ever had a similar type of panicky experience. So go for that now. I'll have a quick look. and see if there's anything coming up. Yeah, oh, lots of messages. I'm thinking that probably a lot of you have had this kind of experience. Brilliant. Yes, 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 fantastic. Okay, that's great to hear. So, you know, I think it's really important to share these experiences. It can feel quite shameful, and part of the power of them is the secrecy. That's what creates the shame. So I think it's really important that we do talk about these experiences. They're not talked about much in climbing, but you know, I don't think I've met a climber yet that hasn't had at least one of those types of experiences. All right, what am I going to cover? I'm going to close the chat, otherwise I'm going to get super distracted and try to answer as I go along. All right, so I'm going to just cover the following things: a little bit about the anxiety experience and a model of anxiety, how it all kind of links together. I'm going to talk about the performance arousal curve. I'm going to talk about how you can put yourself in the right sort of space so that, you know, those kind of fears, panic attacks are less likely to happen. How you notice when anxiety starts to creep in, and then really, what do you do? And this is always the thing that I want to come back to, is be practical. What can you actually do when you've noticed the anxiety creeping up? How are you going to manage your physical symptoms? How are you going to manage your thoughts? How are you going to manage your behaviours? And then what do you do afterwards to try to have an experience that doesn't put you off climbing next time? Okay, so here we go. All right, so those of you who've seen me present before might have seen this model of anxiety. So it's based on a cognitive behavioural model of anxiety. And that's essentially showing how our thoughts, our feelings, and what we do and what we feel in our body is all linked together. And due to my sort of poor PowerPoint skills, I'm showing this really with a unidirectional arrows, but actually it's multi-directional. Sometimes call this the hot cross bun model of anxiety. And CBT would say that your thoughts come first, and that leads to changes in your physiological state and in your feelings, and then in what you do as well. However, I think by now we would say that it's not for everyone that the thoughts come first. Some people are just aware of changes in their body. Some people just notice that they're rushing or getting really sweary on a route. Other people notice the feelings first. So I think the important thing to remember about this is it is a cycle, and one thing leads to another. So you can end up very quickly in a kind of vicious cycle. The plus point of that is we can also reverse that and try to turn this into what we call a virtuous circle. I just also want to mention this thing out to the left, psychological safety behaviours. And I think this is something that is maybe a little bit less obvious sometimes, but these are things that we do that give us an illusion of safety, but actually serve no real purpose. So an example of this would be mid-route, checking your knot. Now, I'm not really sure how you're going to retie your knot mid-route, okay? But the problem with the psychological safety behaviours is they give us a moment's relief from the anxiety, but then actually the more we look for those kind of reassurances, then the anxiety tends to come back with more force. So they're a really crucial part of maintaining the anxiety cycle. So really, really important to think about things that you might do that might give you a bit of relief temporarily, but actually adding to your problem. And I'll give some examples in a minute. Okay, so that's the model we're going to work with tonight. There are other models around, but I think this one is quite a helpful one in terms of explaining how we can actually intervene when we're starting to get really stressed on a route or on a highball problem or whatever. Okay, so here's some examples of how it might fit together. You might want to jot down for yourselves right now any typical thoughts you have, any feelings, anything you notice going on in your body, and then what you tend to do when you get really stressed. So, for example, you know, thinking about, was my gear good? Oh, there's no holds here. That hold is really rubbish. I'm going to fall. And certainly for me on that route in Pembroke, I was just thinking, I can't do these moves. I can't do this back and forth thing. I just can't do it. What I wasn't thinking about was other things I could have done instead of it. But I was very fixated on all the things that were wrong with this route. So that might be a familiar experience to some of you. What was I feeling? Anxious, scared, really embarrassed as well, because I was by this point making quite a lot of noise, and you know, nobody likes to make a lot of noise in a cave because it kind of echoes around and it's not great. Physical symptoms. So these are caused by adrenaline, cortisol release. You have this kind of increased heart rate, sweating, hyperventilating or panting, maybe breath holding for some of you, disco leg or very jerky, shaky movements because you've got all that kind of increased muscle tension. And then typically what happens is people end up either rushing or they get over gripping, or they might even freeze up. And I know that's something that some of you have really wanted me to address. So I'm going to talk through what you do about freezing up as well. And then over on the left as well, some examples of psychological safety behaviours, checking the knot, trying to put the wrong bits of gear in, maybe checking your belayer multiple times. It could even be, you know, just replaying the last bit of gear rather than focusing on getting the next bit of gear in. So lots of things that are focused on, I guess, the safety or danger element, but not actually focused on helping you to climb the next section, if that makes sense. Okay, so just going back to my rushing to get there and having cycled, I think it's a really interesting to think about our arousal levels. So what you'll often see in sports psychology books is these sort of performance arousal curves. So basically saying there's like an optimal zone of arousal, or you might see it expressed as stress sometimes, but I think that, you know, I'm not really sure it is stress. It's more like a level of sort of excitement, as it were. And there's this idea that, you know, it's a nice smooth curve and so on, that you've got this zone at the top where your performance is at its best when you've got just the right amount of excitement, interest, arousal in your nervous system, and that's when you're going to perform at your best. And we kind of know that those curves are slightly different depending on the task in hand. So if it's something very easy and repetitive, then you need more arousal to kind of get that optimum performance. If it's something quite complex, and I would say climbing is definitely complex, then that curve will shift left a little bit. Okay, so you actually need less arousal for more complex and difficult tasks. Now, this looks really nice and simple, but actually I don't think performance really goes like this. There's another model which I think is much more accurate. So this is Hardy and Faisy's model, and it's the catastrophic decline in performance. Okay, so this happens really, and I think this is what happened to me on that route, when you've got a high level of physical arousal, so my bike ride, I guess, and rushing, and then a high level of cognitive anxiety. So I was definitely quite put off by what was ahead of me, this kind of dark tunnel with a light at the end. And so rather than having this kind of nice arousal curve where I had hit my sweet spot, what happened was I went over the edge and then had this kind of catastrophic decline in performance where I could barely climb, to be honest. So I'm not sure if that sounds familiar to you, but what I would say is often we end up thinking about psyching up for climbs. And I have met in coaching over the last 15 years, I've only met a handful of climbers who really need to psych up to climb. Most people needed to psych down. Okay, so they were already at quite a high level of arousal when they came to lead or to boulder or whatever, or compete. And it was then very, very easy for them to tip over into this, you know, away from the sweet spot, over the side, and to kind of a catastrophic performance. So first learning point for everyone, I would say, is have a think about you. Are you generally a laid back person in life? What's your baseline level of excitement, arousal like? You might be able to tell from me, I'm quite a hyper kind of person. So I have quite high levels of arousal generally. You also then want to think about what else is going on in your life at that time. And have you got a lot of other stresses going on? Because that, again, is going to lift your arousal levels up. But for most people, you're going to want to get yourself quietened and calmed before you start climbing. Okay, so a really important point. Something I definitely didn't do in Pembroke. All right, so how do you do that dampening down of your arousal levels? Well, we know that anything that makes the muscles longer is quite good. So like things like some of the yoga techniques, stretching, anything that kind of involves that lengthening of muscles, which is kind of the opposite of that tight muscles we get when we're very stressed. That's helpful. We know that certain breathing techniques can be useful, and I'm going to go through some of those in a minute. Again, releasing that muscle tension. You could try, for example, quietening music. You can also try things like a pre-climb routine. Now, this works when you have a little set routine that you use every single time you go climbing, whether you are you know, just fingerboarding, for example, or whether you are training at the wall, or whether you're trying to, you know, send your best lead. So having something that you go to every time gives yourself a bit of a rhythm and a routine to help you to kind of settle into climbing. So that can be really useful if you set it up beforehand. And then we also know that for some people, kind of using mindfulness type skills and having a very sensory focus, where you might take a few minutes perhaps to meditate, or to get really involved in some of the sounds or the sights or the textures in front of you. So I went for a walk the other evening to just across the moor where I live, and along a stream. And what was really interesting for me was to think about, I was very involved in this report I've been writing at work, but the sounds of the river actually really jolted me out of that. And what was lovely about that was I then got this experience of being very absorbed in the sound of the river moving, and my thoughts kind of quietened down. All right. So I think if you're used to using those sorts of skills, then that can be quite a good way of reducing some of the cognitive anxiety that can go along with climbing. Okay, so lots there. I'm going to keep moving forward because there's so many things I want to cover in this session. But hopefully you've got some ideas up there about starting out right, and also all the things that I didn't do on that route in Pembroke. The other thing you can think about doing is having a bit of a brain warm up. So, I mean, I know, like, it will say in all the books you must warm up before you climb. I bet most of you don't actually warm up when you climb, especially if you're outdoors. You might maybe pick an easier route, but are you genuinely warming up? And are you warming up your brain as well as your body? So thinking about that can be really helpful, even if it's just bouldering around a bit at the bottom of the wall, but something to get you into climbing mode and out of whatever it is you've been doing beforehand. I think it's also quite important to think about what you're trying to achieve with this route, because we can get into a bit of a habit of being send, and always trying to increase the difficulty and always trying to kind of climb at our limit. And that's not realistic to keep up with in terms of our arousal levels, and certainly thinking about climbing out of lockdown now as we come back, we're going to need to scale things back quite a bit and just have some routes in the bag where we're just getting used to the whole thing again. Okay, so I think trying to be really clear about that. Do you need to take some backup or get out gear with you? What are you aiming to do here? Are you aiming to try your hardest? Are you aiming to get a kind of a brain workout? Are you aiming to practice some techniques and so on? But thinking about your reason for doing it, so your why, that shouldn't be about someone else's should. Okay, so I think my route in Pembroke, I kind of knew it wasn't right for me, but I went along with it, and I really wish I had spoken up and said, you know what, I don't really fancy this. I'm not. This is not my kind of thing. But I kind of just went along with, you know, the other person's choice, and I think that was a real mistake and part of the reasons I went into a kind of panicked mode. So have a think about that. Who are you doing this for? Why are you doing it? What's the point of it for you? Definitely don't rush. Take your time, and, you know, asking, often people feel like they take too long to get ready, or too long to climb, or too long to sort their rack out and so on. And I think there's something again about, for women, to own that space really, that, you know, you can take as long as you need to, but trying to prematurely rush yourself onto a route is not going to do you any favours in terms of your arousal levels. They're going to start creeping up the more that you rush. And then the other thing about starting out right is thinking about, where are your pause points? Where are you going to take stock and manage your arousal levels? So if they are starting to creep up, where can you do something to sort of dampen things down? So they might be rests, they might be gear points, they might be ledges, they might just be sections of easier climbing where you can kind of slow it right down and have a moment to just reset things a little bit. And also you might want to have a get out plan. And again, I think there's quite a lot of comfort in that. We often don't like to think about the worst case scenario, but if you already know what you were going to do in that worst case scenario, that can be kind of mentally filed away and give you some kind of peace of mind around that, I think. It also means you've probably done a decent risk assessment of what you're going to be doing. So I think that those are real helpful ways of starting out on the right foot if you're going to come back into leading or bouldering, whatever, as we come out of lockdown. Okay, so I would really advocate that you think about your levels of anxiety, your levels of arousal. So you can use a kind of thermometer, a mental thermometer. You can use a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is kind of asleep and 10 is terrified. You know, I would say you're thinking about having a reset point when you're in the sort of 5 upwards range. If it's getting beyond a 7 out of 10, then really this is kind of survival mode, and actually you're more or less into a panic attack. It's going to be very hard to claw it back from that point. So that's your contingency plan. I put rescue in inverted commas. It doesn't mean that you would need someone to rescue you, but it means that you will do whatever it takes to survive the next sort of section of the climb until you feel safe again. So at that point, we don't really think straight. So you want to be getting in early every time in terms of just dampening down the arousal levels again. So think about that thermometer. Think about trying to keep it more in the green zone and not really tipping too much into the amber zone, and certainly not into the red zone, because there kind of all bets are off. You're not really learning. You're not able to think straight. It's going to be very difficult to get anything to calm yourself down from that point unless you're absolutely safe again. Okay, so this is the bit where we're going to get super practical. So I don't know, I can't see you, so I don't know how you're sitting right now or where you are, but it's worthwhile getting yourself sort of comfortable in your chair. And we're just going to go through 2 ways of managing physical symptoms. So the first one, and you might have done this before, is diaphragmatic breathing, so breathing from the belly. Easiest way to start this, if you can, is to lie down, one hand on the chest and one hand on the belly, and just breathe normally for a minute or so. And for some of you, you might notice that your belly hand is moving more than your chest hand. For others, it might be kind of equal. And if you're like me, giving a slightly scary webinar, your chest hand might be moving more. But when we're relaxed, what happens is it's the belly that's moving more than the chest, ideally. So as we breathe in, it's a bit like a balloon expanding in the stomach. And as we breathe out, that balloon sort of contracts. Another way to think of it is kind of bellows, pulling air into the lungs and the belly, opening up and pushing the air out again. So as we're breathing in, that belly hand rises, and as we breathe out, the belly hand falls. Okay, so that's your basic belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing. You can really finesse this, I think, by having a longer, slower out breath than in breath. So for example, you could breathe in for the count of 3 and out for the count of 5, or in for 5 and out for 7. But it's the out breath that's super, super important. And I think what we tend to do when we are stressed is we might hold our breath. Yeah, so we're kind of chested again, chest breathing, or we might hyperventilate like this. And again, that's kind of chest breathing. But when we try and rescue it, the tendency is to take a deep breath, and that usually means breathing in. And of course, if you can see me, what happens then is I end up using my chest more and not my belly. So I would say focus on the out breath. So if you notice yourself, your breathing is going a bit skew-if, and your anxiety levels are getting higher, then focus on that out breath so that you end up using your belly more in the breathing than your chest. So I would say this is always a temptation, isn't it? Just to try and pull it out the bag when you're climbing. But if you can practice this regularly, it'll be there in your armory when you need it. It's also really helpful if you can practice, excuse me, if you can practice the transition as well between breath holding or hyperventilating and that breathing out. Okay, so if you know that you tend to breath hold, then practice doing that and then switching into the belly breathing by that breathing out, long, slow breath out. And if you know that you hyperventilate when you get stressed, and again, practice that and practice transitioning. You can do a final sort of finesse of this as well with the horse lips technique. So I'm actually really bad at this, but what that means is as you breathe out, you kind of let your lips go a bit floppy. Okay. So that's another way of just ensuring that you've got that lovely long slow breath out, you've got a relaxed kind of face as you're doing it. And these types of breathing have been shown in research to be quite helpful for, again, settling kind of nervous system down, relaxed brain waves, that kind of thing. Okay. All right, hopefully that made sense. So the next technique is progressive muscle relaxation, and I will talk you through the longer version. And then we can go into what you might do on an actual climb, how you might do a shorter version of that that's more accessible. So with muscle tension, that's what tends to happen when we get stressed. It's one of the sort of physical symptoms of anxiety. We end up holding lots of tension. And I think climbing particularly, we end up putting lots of force through the shoulders and the neck. So that can also mean that we are more likely to experience that kind of muscle tension and feed into the anxiety cycle. So it really pays to pay attention to the tension you're holding, whether you're over gripping anywhere or holding anything really, really tightly that you don't need to. It's quite hard to just relax your muscles if you've ever tried that. So what I find is easier and is a sort of proven technique is to exaggerate the tension first. So make them more tense before you then release and let them go. Okay, so we're going to start with our feet. What we're going to do is we're going to tighten the muscles in our feet. So if you've got socks or shoes on, scrunch your feet up inside those, make them really, really tight and let them go. And you can breathe out as you let them go. We're going to do the legs next. So calf muscles, knees, thighs, make everything really tight in those muscles. Watch out for cramp. Make it tight, tight, tight. And release and breathe out. That's good. Now we're going to go for the core. So belly, buttocks, back, everything really tight. And release. Shoulders up to the ears, biceps, make fists, everything really super tight. And release. And then we're going to do the face. So jaw, tongue, face muscles, everything super, super tight. And release. Okay, and then what we're going to do is try and bring the whole body now to a single point of tension. So feet, legs, core, arms, shoulders, fists and face, and jaw, tight, 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 tight. And release. Okay, so obviously that's the long version, and that, again, the more you practice that, the easier you will find to notice where you hold tension in your body and also to be aware of how to release it. But, you know, typically when we're climbing, what we're doing is over gripping, we're keeping the shoulder girdle very, very tight and tense. We might also, you know, if you've got disco leg, you'll know that you'll be holding tension perhaps in your calf muscles. So making a conscious effort to actually over tighten those and then release to the degree that you can. Okay, so we're on a pause point. We're starting to notice the anxiety levels creeping up. We're kind of hanging on maybe with our right hand and we've kind of got a hip in, but we maybe don't need the left hand quite so much. So that's the one I'm going to focus on. I'm going to over tighten that one. And then I'm going to just release it to the point where I'm just holding on. I'm going to tighten my calf muscles and then just drop into my heels a little bit more. So I release the calf muscles. It could just be that you're holding a lot of tension in your face. So again, tightening that, tighten the jaw and releasing that out. So it's about figuring out which bits of you don't need that much in that moment and trying to release the tension there. Again, just to dampen things down a little bit. Okay, hopefully that made sense. I can see time's ticking away. I just got to keep going through. Okay. All right, what about thoughts then? Because I mean, this can be a massive component, can't it, in terms of our climbing. What I will say is, so those of you who came to the webinar I did back in February, we're talking about our inner critic and ways to kind of to introduce doubt into those doubting thoughts. But when you're actually on the climb, I would say try not to get into a mental argument. So that's not the time to be doing CBT or anything like that. What's more helpful at that moment is to put your attention into something helpful. And helpful cues for our attention are the sensory things around us. It could be the sort of the foothold. So again, that idea of pressing into your feet is never going to be wasted effort. So there's a kind of grounding technique around that, around pressing down into the soles of your feet. We've got the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. You could also do something like clinking your gear, for example. Again, just to give you something sensory to kind of get into. You could get very absorbed in, the textures or colours of the rock in front of you. But something that is going to be helpful to your performance, that is about the here and now, and that is not really getting you too wrapped up in your thoughts. Now, sometimes I like to ask myself, am I okay right now? So going back to that route in Pembroke that I was on, I was very much focused on, if I fall off, I'm going to take this massive pendulum swing into this huge yawning chasm and I'll never get back on the rock again. But actually that hadn't happened, okay? And so where I was right then, I was okay. My mind was racing ahead into what might happen. So there's something about unhooking from that future possibility and asking, am I okay right now? And some of these grounding techniques will also help you to do that, to get back into the present. The other thing you can think about is, these are just thoughts. This is not reality. This is something my brain is creating. So there's lots of techniques that come from a different model, but around just saying, thanks brain, thanks for telling me about all the things that can go wrong. You can even sing your thoughts out loud. So I'm going to fall off and swing and I'm never going to get back on again, to that kind of tune, operatic or happy birthday or anything like that. So what you're doing there is you're trying to introduce a little bit of distance between you and the thoughts, okay? So that observer mode. And I definitely clicked into that once I got to the belay, and and my friend said to me, Beck, you've got to help yourself. I was able to kind of snap out of being very, very fused with my thoughts and what might happen, and be able to step back into that observer position. So that's what I would say. Try not to get too engaged in trying to counteract your thoughts, like, of course you're not going to fall, or anything like your gear's good and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't tend to help too much in the moment. That is directing your attention away from what might help you to actually climb. Okay, so we don't want to get involved in a mental argument, but grounding techniques, pushing into your feet. There's a whole sort of exercise around the soles of the feet, which I don't think I've got time to do now, but if we have time at the end, we'll go through it. But anything that's going to ground you in the here and now and help you to distance yourself slightly from those thoughts so that you can unhook from them and they don't feel like they are so present and all-encompassing, I guess. Okay. So what about the behaviours? So, if you know a bit about anxiety, we tend to have these 3 different responses: fight, flight, and freeze. And those are evolutionary helpful behaviours. They were designed to get us out of trouble back when we were cave people. Fighting off a predator, running away, or staying hidden is the freezing response. What is really important to do here is try to resist those kind of evolutionary helpful behaviours. It's difficult, but if you find yourself in flight mode and you're rushing, try to slow down. If you find yourself very kind of angry, fighting, that's usually over gripping. So again, we're going to want to try and release that tension. What we can also do is to kind of widen the gaze. So when we get very, very stressed, we become very fixated on certain things. Again, usually dangerous things or danger cues, I would say. So, what's the belayer doing? Where's the last bit of gear? More around maybe getting stuck on what holds are not there rather than the holes that are there. So you can do this kind of soft eyes technique. So it's a bit tricky with a screen, but if you want to look away from the screen for a minute, pick a spot on the wall and really hone your focus on it, a bit like a kind of laser pointer on it, and try and blur out everything else around it, but just fixate on that one spot. Okay, so hopefully you've got that. then what I want you to do is to soften your gaze and widen your focus. So this is a bit like if you've been to the opticians and you've done that peripheral vision test, where you try to see as much as possible around you without moving your head and without fixating on anything. So eyes are kind of still, but you're widening and softening the focus. Now, there's been some nice research recently done around that, which says that that widening of focus, again, is quite helpful for settling down the nervous system. It's the opposite of the hypervigilant response, where we're stuck on and we can only see one thing. And I'm sure you've had that experience as well, where, you know, you're desperate to get a piece of gear in, you can't see the moves, and the minute you get gear in, you find a massive jug that you just didn't see was there because your focus was totally on something else. So this is a way of trying to kind of widen the gaze, settle the nervous system down. It should also help you to spot possibilities that you weren't maybe aware of. So again, we're looking for things that are relevant to our climbing, and we are trying to get our attention onto those rather than onto safety type behaviours. And it sounds like a bit of a paradox, because when we're scared, we want to be safe. But what's going to help you is thinking about the textures in the rock and where the, you know, where the friction is good, or where there's a little tiny edge for your foot, or how you can hold the hold differently. That's going to help you more at this point than checking what your belay is doing, for example. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. All right, let's talk about freezing, because this is something that I know is super, super common, and it's a real pain to get out of. It is, again, it was designed by whoever designed us to be a helpful response for us to hide, but people can get really, really stuck on routes. So my advice here is to do the things we already talked about, like the breathing and the muscle relaxation, and then just try to generate a small amount of side-to-side movement. It doesn't have to be big. So just very, very small movements, maybe foot to foot, just a bit more pressure, one foot to the other, for example. And gradually work up to seeing, can you just momentarily release a hand or release a foot? Not to move, so you're not aiming to move at this point. You're just aiming to release slightly. And then gradually increasing that movement. So you might start then with kind of just reaching slightly, a foot up, transferring your weight more onto the other foot, for example, until you get to the point where you feel you can commit to the next move. And that might take quite a bit of time, but the key here is to be patient and to try to generate that movement. Okay, so small movements to start with, a little bit of rocking backwards and forwards, or even just slightly adjusting your weight, and then gradually increasing so you can release. Before then you start to think about moving. And then we're into moving, we might be into reaching, we might be into tapping, and then you should find that you should be able to just commit to the next moves. Be patient with that, and if you're somebody who tends to freeze up, you might want to go through a few cycles of breathing out, muscle tense and release, before you then start to go for this kind of generating small movements. Okay. The other thing to really avoid is, I don't think Nick is actually checking his belay here. I think he's looking for footholds, but but is trying to avoid checking knots. So I do think you should check your knot once only at the bottom. I do think you should have a discussion with your belayer once at the bottom about what's going to happen. And I do think when you put your gear in, you want to check it once again, and maybe say out loud, you know, the gear is good. But checking any more than that is not going to ease your anxiety. In fact, it's going to add to it, because you become less and less certain of yourself. What we know from things like health anxiety is no reassurance is ever enough. And I think there's exactly the same principle in climbing. Once you start checking, you can get into this cycle of checking, and then your focus is more on the thing that you are checking than the actual climbing and moves that might be there for you for the taking. Okay, so what you want to be doing here is, if you notice yourself checking, if you know you're a checker, try to wean yourself off it. So if you tend to check 3 or 4 times on a route, let's go for 3 times next week, 2 times the week after, and once the week after that. So gradually ease it down. Try not to do that if you find yourself getting scared on a route. You want to be trying to use that as a cue to direct your focus onto something that's going to help you climb. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, one of the questions again is like, what should I do? You know, like I've been through my breathing cycle, I've released my muscle tension, I am still super, super stressed. What on earth do I do now? I don't feel I can climb. So ideally, you want to be staying where you are until the anxiety decreases. Now, the reason for this is if you shoot up the route or get a rope out or lower off, and you're still very, very stressed, you're leaving that route with a high level of stress. And that is going to be the thing that your brain remembers, that you escaped the situation, you escaped the kind of high anxiety situation by getting off. And that doesn't help you long term. So ideally, if you can get extra gear in, hang in your harness, you know, down climb to a bolt or whatever, and hang there and stay there until your anxiety levels start to come down. So you would be, again, using the breathing, using the muscle tension release, using the mindfulness techniques, for example, and just waiting it out until your adrenaline levels sort of start to come down again. At that point, then you can decide what you're going to do. And I suppose it's thinking about here, what was your objective originally? So you might decide that, you know what, I have pushed the envelope enough for today and I'm really very, very shaky. So, you know, discretion is the better part of valor. Let's come off. It might be that you say, you know what, having hung here for a minute, I can see the next moves and I can see where the next bit of gear is and I'm going to go to that. And then I'll make another decision at that point. It might be that you just say, I'm just going to get back on and hold those holds again and stick that out for a bit. And then I'm going to come down. So here, what we're trying to do, I guess, is if you imagine your comfort zone as an elastic band, what we never want to do is to snap that elastic band. What we want to do is to gently stretch it and hold it under a little bit of that stretch. Now, over time, that will stretch the band gradually. Okay. But again, a little bit of stretch and holding the stretch, that is way, way better than snapping the band. So have a really careful think about whether you can go on or not. Whether you want to just do a little stretch in where you are now and then come down, or whether you feel actually, I'm okay, I've got it under control again now and I can go on. And what you do need to be aware of is that, you know, adrenaline can persist in the body for quite a long time. Cortisol can persist for a really long time in the body. So actually you might find that even though you feel okay after a little kind of pause and reset, the anxiety levels might shoot up again very, very quickly. So if you had a really super scary experience, I would say, again, play it a bit safe. Think about your long-term climbing career. You know, you might feel really proud of yourself for having battled through this route, but what will that do to you next time you come to climb? And just to kind of weigh it up. And that's going to be something that you'll need to do in the moment, I think. If you do have a full-on panic attack, and that's kind of scores of 7 and above, or where you're really, really hyperventilating, you can't think straight at all, and you're fully in survival mode, you really need to think about not climbing again for a little while. Okay, so I don't necessarily mean don't climb again that day, but certainly not that route. Come down, do some of the things we talked about right at the beginning, which were about quietening down your arousal levels before you then attempt to get back on something. And you certainly want to dial down massively on the difficulty or the complexity or the kind of the scariness for you after that. So you want to be leaving with, you know, a good experience, having hopefully exited the climb with sort of lower levels of anxiety, kind of feeling calmer, maybe having had a bit of stretch, but not a snap in your comfort zone band. And, you know, coming away with some kind of good feeling that actually, yeah, I had a terrible time at one point, but I managed to get something out of it or rescue it in some way. And that is enough for today. So climbers are terrible, really, I think, for just pushing on when we actually would be better off thinking long term about, you know, kind of how am I going to feel next time I rock up to this crag or with this climbing partner or this route. Okay, so afterwards, you do need to do that soothing of your nervous system. I think it's also super important that we try to pull out the learning from that. So what did you do well? And it might be something really, really tiny. So my route in Pembroke, what did I do well? It was pretty hard to think of something at the time. I guess what I came to was that I just kept moving forward, even though I was really scared. And that was kind of, you know, that was good. I was pleased with that. I wasn't really pleased with the other stuff, but you know, it's made a good basis for a talk. So maybe I did get something out of it after all. You might also want to use that experience as a as part of a thought record. And if you came to my talk last month, we were talking about, you know, recurring themes in our thoughts, and that will give you some really helpful data for using some techniques outside of climbing to kind of work on challenging those negative thoughts that tend to pop up for you. So again, we're not trying to replace those with positive ones. What we're trying to do is introduce some doubt to some of the ideas that we've got in our mind. So, you know, you can get quite a lot of data out of a terrible experience, a scary experience. Okay, so just to summarize, and there's like so much to summarize, and I want to leave time for questions because I can see them coming in, which is brilliant. Try to start out calm. So take that time to do that, really invest in that. That is part of your climb. Don't be tempted to just kind of, I've got to make the most of this and get on there as quick as possible. Don't want to hold anyone up, etc. Try and take your time. Think about your pause points and have those dotted at regular intervals on the route. If you can see them, that's brilliant. You know, or check out the guidebook and look for those kind of easier sections, or belays. In fact, belays and multi-pitch are a great place to try to reset yourself and kind of release some of that tension that might be building up. Breathing out rather than deep breaths in. So not. Okay, thinking about exaggerating tension first and then releasing it. Thinking about grounding techniques rather than kind of getting involved in a mental argument with yourself. And then techniques like, you know, I'm okay where I am. These are just thoughts. Thank you, brain. Singing those thoughts out. In terms of behaviours, resisting those fight, flight, freeze responses. So doing the opposite almost of those. Trying not to get into checking mid-route, because that's not going to help you. You want to be really thinking about things that are going to help you climb. So that's generally the texture of the rock is kind of the most helpful thing. And then it's about knowing when to quit and trying to leave the situation feeling relatively calm and having been able to pull out some of the positives. Okay. I'm just going to show there are some resources out there which are kind of helpful. So I love this book, Anxiety is Really Strange. Let's just show it here. This is this one. So it's got some really nice stuff in it about anxiety and about the physiological side of it and so on, and how it impacts on behaviour. The Happiness Trap, I kind of recommend this all the time, but that's a different sort of model to the one I've discussed tonight. But it's got some really useful things to say about how we get hooked by our thoughts and feelings and how we can sort of take that observer position. If you like CBT, then this is a good one, Overcoming Anxiety. If you like ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, this is a great book, ACT in Sport. If you don't mind swearing, this is a good one. It's aimed at triathletes, but there's some really useful stuff in there about kind of doing stuff even though you're anxious and scared. Some good stuff in there. And then also lots of CBT, nice CBT worksheets on psychology tools. And one I haven't put on there is this book, which is a nice intro to mindfulness, I think, around feelings, particularly everyday enlightenment. So that's a really nice text. Okay, I'm going to take a drink and have a look at the questions, which I think I can click on now. Right, Emmeline, oh, ouch, dislocated shoulder. That sounds really, really painful. Tips for managing the fear of dislocation of the vulnerable shoulder. Yeah, that is a really hard one. Your physio is confident in it, so that's good. So I guess this is maybe one that might be worth doing off the wall, I think, and thinking about some of those anxious thoughts and trying to introduce cognitive doubt to them. So we would be looking at things like, you know, what's the evidence for me thinking like this? What evidence have I got? How can I test this out, for example? How can I see if this shoulder is feeling good or not feeling good? And doing some behavioural experiments and trying to modify some of those thoughts a little bit. And I think that would help you in coming to it. I think then also it's to watch for, when we've got an injury, we tend to hold a lot of muscle tension around it, and that can really feed into that anxiety cycle. So probably for you, I would say managing that muscle tension would be super important, and making sure that you're not then making you more vulnerable to kind of the anxiety and the fear, and also more vulnerable to injury if you're holding a lot of tension around that. So hopefully that kind of answers that. Okay. When you can reach a hole but don't believe you can. Yeah, that's kind of linked to the freezing stuff, actually. So I would say that you want to be starting to generate those small movements. So we try to break the movement down into the smallest bit possible, but makes it more believable for our brain to kind of go for it. So I began thinking about, okay, can I release anything? Can I move my weight over? So often if we're not reaching something, it's because we're not fully committing in terms of moving our weight over onto our feet. So how can you start to just generate that movement? And maybe you've got one high foot, one low foot, just releasing that lower foot a little bit, gradually increasing the kind of momentum with it, and then starting to straighten the leg or to twist more or whatever it is you need to do. So again, small movements popping up like that, and trying to kind of get yourself more familiar, I think. So it's partly that we're unfamiliar with the commitment needed for that long move. So breaking that down into small steps and becoming more familiar with it means that it becomes suddenly a bit more doable. Okay, yeah, so also a question around realistic fears when actually to fall would be really, really difficult or dangerous in some way or painful. And I think that's a really relevant point. And certainly on a lot of the less than vertical routes, anything really VS and below, you're going to end up with lots of stuff that you really don't want to fall onto. So that actually is a really, that is a relevant fear in that situation. But again, I think the advice is still the same. So I would say, again, breathing out. If you've got to keep moving because there's no rest, then keep that breathing nice and steady. And also to maybe think about, again, those climbing specific cues. What is going to help me to climb here? So rather than getting hooked with our attention, our focus onto the danger element, what is going to help me to actually climb here? So maybe softening the gaze, again, could be useful in terms of just dampening down the anxiety a little bit, and then maybe opening up some new possibilities and getting your focus away from the kind of the thing you're going to fall onto. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, Jane, factors that underpin the CBT model. So how can you improve your self-belief so you're less prone to negative thoughts? That's a really good question. So I guess one of the models that I work with sometimes is looking at core beliefs that underpin some of our negative thoughts. Now, that's usually due to our own sort of life experiences, early experiences, and so on. But for people who have kind of quite low self-confidence, low self-esteem, you're going to be much more prone to negative thoughts. And our brain is wired to pay more attention to negative thoughts. So a bit of a two-pronged approach, really. And I talked about this in the presentation last month a little bit. We might be looking at, again, trying to dig into, what's behind those thoughts, what are the core beliefs, and trying to look for evidence, for and against those, what are the factors involved in that, and trying to kind of introduce some doubts into the doubts that you have, essentially, the doubting beliefs. And that way, that makes the negative thoughts a bit less likely to happen. There is also the other school of thought, which says that actually, the main problem here is that we try to avoid our negative thoughts, and the more acceptance we bring to them, the less likely they are to trouble us. So it kind of depends on which way you want to go down. If you want to go down a kind of a schema route, which is underpinning sort of CBT, or whether you want to go down an acceptance and commitment therapy route where we would focus more on just unhooking from those negative thoughts. But if you're wanting to kind of improve self-belief, self-confidence comes from, previous experiences. But that also means that we need to pay attention to the things we're doing well. It comes from vicarious experiences. So that's people that I can identify with that are like me, doing the same things I want to do. It comes from managing our emotions, and there's some techniques in this presentation to help with that. And it also comes from kind of, verbal persuasion. So that might be what other people say to us and what we say to ourselves. But what we do know is that verbal persuasion is the least effective way of developing confidence. So I think there's some argument there for thinking about scaffolding your own experiences really, really carefully, for climbing with people that you can identify with and using them as role models, and also around the emotional control strategies, the emotional management strategies. Okay, Rosie, what is an effective way to train to alleviate fear of falling? Oh my word, that is a whole other presentation in and of itself. I will say this, I'm not a massive fan of falling practice for lots and lots and lots of reasons. I don't think it suits everyone, and it's also not done in the way that you know, systematic desensitization or exposure work was intended. Okay, so in the way that we typically see it with climbers. So I am going to be doing a workbook on this actually, which should be out in a couple of months maybe, but to work through it. But there's lots of different elements around fear of falling. Certainly if you are going to do falling practice, you need to be in a relaxed state when you do it, and that's where most people tend to go wrong. You can still use the same sort of strategies we talked about today around fear of falling, about kind of getting your focus on climbing relevant cues, around managing your emotions, managing the kind of physical arousal, and, you know, kind of defusing, unhooking from some of the thoughts that you might have. So yeah, fear of falling, a whole other presentation, but hopefully that's given you some clues. Okay, Maddie, too high arousal when you realise you can send a route and problem you've been working. Okay, yeah, so this is like a fear of failure, isn't it? A fear of not achieving it. I think the mindfulness stuff is really, really helpful here, because not just the mindfulness practice, but a kind of mindfulness in attitude, which is practicing non-attachment, I guess, to outcomes and judgments. So what we tend to think is, you know, I should be able to do this. It's like a judgment about an expectation about what we're going to be able to do. So mindfulness would sort of say that we can try to turn that a little bit on its head and approach it with curiosity. So I wonder how this is going to go. So maybe some mindfulness practice would be helpful in that as well. But generally, again, arousal strategies, you probably still need to dampen it down. So, you know, you've got that excitement perhaps when you know that a route is really close to being sent. So something that's just going to just drop your arousal levels down a little bit should be helpful in that scenario. Okay, Janina, yes, scared after to lead again. Okay, yeah, I think there's going to be loads of us scared to lead, especially after such a long layoff that we've had with lockdown. And if you've been injured, yeah, that can be really, really tricky to work around that. I would just say, you know, be really gentle on yourself, and you need to be wanting to lead, not feeling like you should lead. And I think I would really wait until you're itching to lead. You almost can't bear to second or top rope any longer. You're desperate to lead, because that's going to give you that motivation to really work on the fears that come with it. Okay, so, you know, sometimes we can get really sucked into this idea about what the right way to climb is and all the rules around climbing, what we should and shouldn't do. My view is, you know, literally dispatch with that. Do what is right for you. If you need to top rope for the next 6 months, then do that until you're desperate to lead again. If you never want to lead again, that's totally fine. Climbing can be done your way. It doesn't have to be done the way that everyone says you should do it. Okay, Lisa, you've got anxious thoughts about gear failing and you've seen it happen. Okay, I'm wondering there if you've witnessed an accident, and I would say if you have, it might be worth considering whether you still got some sort of traumatic memories of that, because that needs a very specific approach to work on. I think there are things you can do to increase your kind of confidence in your gear. So if you've got access to another 2 people to kind of climb with, then I would say put a top rope up, attach yourself to it, lead up with lots and lots of bits of gear in, and just kind of lower and sit onto that gear so you get the feel of it with a top rope as kind of safety backup. Get used to thinking about, you know, is this gear good or not, and kind of maybe marking it out of 5, but, you know, using that sit on it. And I work with a lot of climbers who won't sit on a hanging belay. They just kind of like, they'll cling to the rock rather than sit on the kind of the gear in the belay. So think about those things, you know. Again, Are the things you're doing habits you have that maybe are feeding into some of the anxiety? Perhaps you're never really sitting and trusting gear at any point. You can do that at the bottom of the crag. Like I say, you can do that on the top rope, but where you can just kind of get that experience of actually, you know, let's sit down here. Let's see if this gear will hold. You might even want to get an instructor to check your gear and just to give you that kind of knowledge that actually, you know, it's okay, my gear is okay. But if it's trauma, then you probably need something that's more specific around trauma to work on it. Okay, something about optimism. So Annette, talking about optimism, worried about the route being hard and the gear being bad and that you will panic. You're worried that things are going to. So improving optimism in climbing. Yes, that's a whole other presentation as well, isn't it? I think it's definitely a skill that can be learned. So it's kind of training ourselves not to be sort of Pollyanna or rose into spectacles about things, but to kind of look for the evidence really that we might be wrong in thinking things are going to go wrong. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm not saying everything's going to go right and I should think about that. What we're more thinking about is, you know, that idea that you won't be able to get through that point, or the gear is really bad, and looking to see if those are true and if you can introduce some doubt there. So again, these are techniques that are probably better done off the crag rather than kind of on the route. But certainly, like in the moments, you know, that am I okay right now, and training yourself to bring your focus back to the present moment is really helpful. So mindfulness doesn't suit everyone, but it's a really helpful practice if it does suit you, for kind of bringing you back to the moment, what's happening right now, not where our brain has gone in projecting into the future, if that makes sense. Okay, I'll take a breather for a minute.
We're going to take these last 3 questions that are here, so please nobody else put any more in, because
it's brilliant. It's so good to have so many questions. I love it. But yeah, if only there was like a coffee break and we could kind of mill around and answer them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Mary, an older climber, feeling creaky and less capable. How do you accommodate reality, ambition, enjoyment with a view to progressing? Yeah, that is a super important point, and something that I am trying to adjust to as my 50 is approaching. I think for you, Mary, probably then looking at the acceptance and commitment therapy stuff would be really good, because what that approach is about is finding out what your values are. So what would be really important to you about climbing. And also the acceptance bit is really key in there, about, you know, accepting reality as it is and still moving towards the things that are important to you. So I would say get yourself this book here. And there's some great tips in that about, you know, being with reality, unhooking from some of the thoughts that kind of erode our confidence, and still being able to move towards the things we love about climbing. Now, it might not be grades, it might be more, you know, thinking about progression in terms of learning new skills and climbing new techniques and so on. So that's how I would be thinking about progression. Maybe not think of it in a grade related way, but more in a broader sense of the word, learning, I guess. Okay, OCD. Oh yes. Do I find there tends to be a correlation between people with anxiety issues and fear of heights when climbing? That's a really good question. I don't know if I've really thought about it, but I would say that, you know, having a fear of heights is a really normal and natural thing to do. We weren't always, it's only very recently that we've got kind of climbing gear, and I think our brains haven't really accommodated that. So I think we're quite hardwired to be worried about heights. And, you know, any of you who've got kids will remember the, you know, the babies with the Moro reflex, where they kind of go whoosh like that if you drop them. So that's kind of hardwired into us to be worried about climbing. You know, most of the climbers I work with have some kind of level of anxiety. A lot of them would do this kind of checking, which has got a lot of similarities with OCD, the compulsions of OCD, but they wouldn't have any issues outside of climbing necessarily. So it's a really interesting question. I kind of don't know what the full answer to that is, but certainly fear of heights would be normal and natural. Fear of falling would be normal and natural, and, you know, to be expected, I guess. So I think the sooner we sort of accept that in ourselves, then that opens up more ways of working with it, rather than wanting that reality not to be true. Okay, Julia. So, oh, I'm really sorry, that's a really hard thing to have experienced growing up, a really, really, really difficult. And I think if you've somebody who's experienced any kind of abuse growing up, then what's often happened is you maybe haven't had that experience of your other people helping you to manage your nervous system arousal levels and to kind of dampen them down for you. So what we know about child development is, babies who are soothed and cared for, and young children who are soothed and cared for and have their needs met, their emotional needs met, they tend to have less reactive nervous systems. If you've experienced a lot of trauma, abuse, a lot of very, very stressful life events, then our nervous systems tend to be very, very reactive, and that can mean that, yes, you can absolutely find that you're very easily tipped into that kind of that fearful, catastrophic sort of state. So what I've seen with a lot of people is some people have this kind of really flat arousal curve where they take a long time to kind of come from 0 to 7 on the anxiety scale, and other people go from 0 to 7 like really, really quickly. So if that's you, you're going to need to look for lots more pause points and to do a lot more active work to kind of keep dampening down that nervous system arousal. But I think it is really possible to do. But it's to understand, I think it's about understanding our own personal kind of anxiety levels, what we were born with, our genetics, what happened to us, and whether our nervous system is super reactive and responsive, or whether you're way more laid back than that. So we're all different in that respect, and it's about working with what we've got, I guess. Oh, there's some brilliant questions there.
Oh, just fiddling with the tech. Amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Maybe I'll even be on the screen. Maybe that works. We've only done this like 30 times now. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for another fantastic talk, and again being able to give evidence-based, which I know is something you're passionate about and is really, really important to us too, but something that's based on evidence and really practical strategies that people can use in the moment. I think there's a lot of trepidation there, and we've all been forced to slow down, and we're all sort of learning the quality of our own minds in certain things, and either looking forward or not looking forward about how we apply that back on the rock and doing what we love doing. So having this kind of refresher right now is really, really helpful, and thank you so much for making that so practical. As I put in the chat, Rebecca is brilliant at this, but rubbish at self-promotion. So again, I've chucked in a link to her website, because there are some really fantastic resources there, both in terms of workbooks and courses. Rebecca, would you like to talk a little bit about the Smart Chalk Bag?
Oh yes, okay. Right, I'll try and just get over myself and do it. So so those of you who are really interested in improving your mental skills in the broader sense, so not necessarily just around fears and so on, I have brought out this mental training package called the Smart Chalk Bag. I can't even say it. So it consists of like a workbook, which it's got lots of places to scribble in here. And then kind of an actual chalk bag with different sort of exercises in it, loads of different cards here. So they've got things like, how do you get better at problem solving? How do you do imagery? How do you do self-talk? How do you set up a climbing routine? That kind of thing. So lots of different ones. They're discipline specific, so you can get trad, boulder, sport, etc. And then there's also a mental skills training journal. So this is to help you to kind of stay on track, but there's some exercise. This is mine, so I filled it in. So there's some exercises here around what are your climbing values, as well as like, your kind of monthly planner and checking in with your techniques and so on. And and then kind of just making a note of how you're doing each week. So it's kind of a journal, but with some psychology type exercises in there as well. So that is available. And I'm also just soon to publish a fear of falling workbook as well, but it's not out yet. So I can't
amazing. We'll put the link around in the follow-up email to this talk for anybody who's interested, as well as the links to all of those books that are on Rebecca's slide and the recording. So there's lots of homework we can be doing in the next month before we potentially might be allowed to get out and do more exciting things. And one day they might open Wales, and then we can have a wonderful
I've just got the new North Wales Bouldering guidebook, so I'm really excited and can't go anywhere. But
So thank you so much, Rebecca, once again. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. On Thursday, we have Naomi. None of us can say her surname, but we'll work that out by Thursday. Who's going to use personal experiences and a lot of climbing experience to talk about how you sort of climb through having had disruptions in your climbing life. So as somebody who is a sponsored athlete, but also has a real job, who's had injuries and illnesses and obviously interruptions in the way that we all are right now, we think that will be really, really helpful. And then next week, we are getting really, really data driven again. So following on from Rebecca, we will have an expert bringing the research on sleep data, so how sleep is good for you, but what you can do to measure the quality of it, how it can affect your performance, how women's sleep is different, and also the first of 2 talks on periods in the menstrual cycle and sort of more the generals of that, but also specifically how it can affect your climbing and how you can move your training around that. So we hope to see you at one of those soon. Thank you so much, Rebecca, once again, and take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed that. It's great questions. Thank you.